Hey there, and welcome to another video. My name's Alex, or Poetaster, if you know me from the internet. So this video is going to be one of two long overdue videos going over my Nintendo controller to MIDI interfaces. This one is going to be focused on the GC to MIDI for Gamecube controllers. There's also going to be a sister video coming out at the same time, around the same time, on my other one, which is N64 controllers. So if future Alex can figure it out, I'll do one of those poppy down thingies to go to that one. Otherwise, it'll definitely be a link. I know how to do that. But anyway, I just wanted to briefly talk about this thing a little bit, and then we'll jump over to the desk and show it off kind of in action. So what this is an Arduino device. Inside this box, it's fairly straightforward, honestly. There's an Arduino powered by USB, micro USB specifically. You've got a button which allows you to switch between different modes. I'll talk about what those modes are and what they do, as well as two lights that indicate what mode you are in. Again, I'll talk about what those modes are and how they work. Will be kind of the crux of the video. And then up here we've got the actual controller connection. This is where you'll connect your device. And finally, we've got kind of a standard MIDI connector. So that's pretty much it as far as the actual hardware of this thing goes. Pretty straightforward. So one thing to note is it does use the USB for power, but it's also always sending MIDI on the USB as well as the 5-pin or standard MIDI connector. So that means this is compatible if you want to use it for DAWs, other USB devices. You really only need one cable. You can just use a USB connection. You're good to go. If you want to use it, however, to control any synthesizer really with a standard MIDI connection, you just power it up with USB, make the connection here with your standard MIDI cable, and you're good to go. Now, because it's sending on both at the same time, if you wanted to, you could get really weird with it, right? You could send MIDI to a DAW and do a synth at the same time, and do kind of whatever you wanted with that. So it opens up some pretty interesting possibilities with that. I just wanted to go over that quickly. I'm just going to use one setup on the desk that kind of shows the functionality, really. But there are a ton of different ways that this can be hooked up, and it can work with just about anybody's setup. This is programmed to use kind of as a guiding principle, at least, the general MIDI concession. Or general MIDI standard, I guess you'd call it. And so, essentially, that doesn't mean you specifically need a general MIDI module. Most, even modern-day synths, are kind of derived from those old standards. However, it does play extremely well with actual general MIDI modules, which is what I'm going to be showing on the desk. But you don't need one at all. It should be compatible with literally any MIDI device. DAWs, drum machines, synths, you name it. Furthermore, for anyone with specialized cases, I'll shamelessly plug, I do offer custom programming. If you take a look at the details of this and you think, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, and you wanted to change how something functions, that is absolutely something I do, and details about that are on my site. So finally, I guess, last thing to mention, I make these and I sell them on my website. So there's going to be links to that below, and I guess just admitting the bias, I think they're super cool because I made them. But trying to be honest and straightforward about what it can do, and show off this demo. But obviously I think it's pretty neat. Anyway, I think that is about all I wanted to do. So let's go ahead and jump over to the desk. Alright, So we're over here at the desk. Let's take a look and just show this thing off and show how it works. A quick overview of my setup here. I've got GC to MIDI unit here. Use the capo to keep it at an angle so that LED doesn't blind y'all. I've got power running to the micro USB port from my USB hub. Again, I could use that to send MIDI if I wanted to. In this case, I'm not using it for that, but it does work just the same way. No extra buttons. It just sends if you've got it hooked up. I've got my Gamecube controller plugged in here. The cable just running off to the side there. And then finally, I've got my MIDI cable hooked into the kind of standard MIDI port going into the MIDI input of the Roland unit. Briefly, I kind of mentioned it in the intro, this Roland unit is a general MIDI module, which I'm using because it kind of does everything. It's got a drum machine, synths, it responds on multiple channels, it plays really nicely as far as just one thing I have to set up to show up all the different functions. Again, you don't need to have a general MIDI device to use this, but it plays really nicely with them. And one thing I did forget to mention in the intro, I did mention my controller connection here, but one thing I didn't specifically say is because the Arduino is essentially reading Gamecube inputs and translating those into MIDI, you can use any Gamecube controller. So I've just got a regular old plug-in kind here, but you should be able to use anything that works with a Gamecube. If you want to use a Wavebird, that should be fine. If you want to use Donkey Kong bongos, I've even got a specific mode for those, actually. We'll show those off here in a bit. Any controller that actually works with the Gamecube will work with this device. It will just kind of map out the controls to the different functions that we're going to talk about in this section. So I do want to point that out. You don't need, you can get a knockoff, a Mad Catz, you can get a cheap new reproduction. It doesn't matter. If it works with Gamecube, it works with this. Alright, so I talked a little bit previously about the modes and these lights. So when you first fire up the unit, it starts with this green light on, and that is drum mode. What drum mode does is it is set up using the general MIDI drum map standard. So as a reference, you can always pull up that drum map. Also, future Alex put up a display here that shows the mapping of what those MIDI notes are. But essentially, it's a standard way to map MIDI notes to percussion instruments. Right, since you're not necessarily playing notes, you're triggering different pieces of the kit. And there is a standard MIDI mapping for that. That is what this device uses out of the box. Most drum machines now, it looks like you can assign each of your pads to whatever you want to use. It seems to vary, just in the ones I've seen, if they come out of the box with that general MIDI setup or not. But most of them I've seen, you can assign a MIDI note to a pad, so you could turn it to that MIDI, that general MIDI standard, even if it doesn't come like that out of the box. Long story short, it should work with just about any drum machine. Now, the other thing to mention is this sends on MIDI channel 10 when you are in drum mode. Reason for that, again, it's just part of the general MIDI standard. Percussion goes on channel 10. That helps this device work with some of these older legacy devices, especially general MIDI modules, where, I mean, if you're sending drum channels on channel 1, it's going to have no idea what to do with that. Drums go on channel 10 and kind of in that world. So that's the channel this uses. Again, if you're using a more modern drum machine that only does drums, it may default to something different out of the box. You may have to go into the settings of your drum machine and say receive on channel 10, because that is where drum mode is sending. So let's take a look then at the different functions. I won't read the entire thing off. The image I showed before, and I'll kind of reference it throughout. I won't just make y'all listen to me read it. That is available in the manual that comes with the device. It's also, you can look at the manual on my website. I've got one here in my lap as a cheat sheet. If you hear pages going, that's what that is. So yeah, just to talk about the general functions, your kind of main drum kit noises I have assigned out to the trigger and face buttons. So to go over that, you've got your kick, you've got your other kick, you've got a snare, your other snare, see if that came through in the recording, weird glitch there, but your other snare, you've got your closed hat, pedal hat, and open. Now in the triggers on the D-pad and joystick, you've got more of the less often used drum sounds, but you still have access to in the class. Of course, toms. I tried to set it so you could do a nice tom roll once you get the hang of it. As well as some of your various percussion noises are all there. And finally, the start button is your Chinese or your big gong hit. It's kind of wimpy on this kit. I'll show off a couple other kits, but this one comes through nicely. It doesn't have the meatiest bass. I figure people might be on their phones. Come through a little better for them. But yeah, so these different controls essentially trigger the various drum samples using, again, that general MIDI map for which note it's sending on channel 10. And then this joystick controls up and down, controls your velocity. If I pull this down, move it to neutral. As I drive it up. I've got a limiter on so I don't blow your eardrums out, but you can hear, especially on that second snare, the increase in velocity as you drive that stick up. And because this is an analog stick, it is a full sweep of control along that stick. Similarly, these sides are your modulation parameter, MIDI CC1. This is because a lot of synths and drum machines will have some kind of a modulation effect. Let's see what this one does. This one seems to be having a bit of a more subtle effect, but pushing this in either direction will drive that CC value. When I'm not touching it, the modulation is at 0. If I push it all the way to the right, that pushes it up to 127. Same thing if I push it the other way, 0 to 127. So this one works a little differently, where velocity down, it doesn't go quite all the way to 0, because that didn't seem helpful. But this pushes it down to the bottom, this pushes it up to the top. With the modulation control, either direction just moves the modulation up. So if you're not holding it, you're not sending any sort of modulation command. So that, especially with modern drum machines, you should be able to assign that MIDI CC1 to whatever you want to control at your fingertips. And just to give a little example here, I'm rhythmically challenged at best. Don't judge me too harshly here. But just to do a little bit of a beat, like... And again, I've tried to design this so that someone more talented than I could actually do some decent finger drumming with this as a controller. I'm personally just useless with that quantization. So I feel like you can't, but use a Roland unit without using the 808 samples. Yeah, again, you've got okay, so you can use your synths to just change kits. It's sending on all the same channels, and you can use this for a pretty cool performance controller, I think. Again, I'm not the best person to demo that, unfortunately, with my lack of rhythm, but would genuinely love to see someone who's good at finger drumming give one of these a go. That would be really exciting. So next up, we are going to talk about Synth Mode. So I mentioned, again, our lights on our modes earlier. When the unit starts up, it's green. That is our drum mode. Pressing this button on the side, the only button, will switch to the blue LED. That lets us know we are in synth mode. So how this works in synth mode is our C stick is essentially going to control our notes. So I'm going to push that up. So how this is mapped is this is just going to play our C major scale, starting by pushing down, and moving around, back to C. Apologies, that artifact is coming through. I'll just sound crazy if it isn't, but for the purpose of this demo, I think it should be alright. But anyhow, so this just plays the notes of the C major scale, essentially your white keys, right? Starting from middle C, going up to the next C. So that's where all the notes live, and from there you use the rest of the controller to essentially modify that. Namely, anyone may have noticed there's a lot of black keys, right? So the Z button will play the corresponding flat for the note being played on the joystick. I chose to go with flats, just that seemed to be the way to go versus sharps. If I screwed up, you can tell me in the comments. But, so instead of playing C, if I press the trigger first, I'll actually play a B, a C flat, right? Same thing. If I play a D, D flat. So that's how it works with the sharps and flats. Essentially, holding this bumper will make it flat. And you can also hear if you start and then press the Z button, it will drop the note. So for instance, we'll do R D. So you don't need to re-trigger the note necessarily. You can kind of smoothly move back and forth between the two. And yeah, the only thing to note is the flat does still apply on those notes that don't theoretically have flats, right? Your C, it's still going to drop it down to a B. F, it will drop it down to an E. I think, I'm not a music theory guy per se, but as I understand, if you're familiar at all with jazz theory especially, flats make sense in that regard, which is why it seemed to fit better to give a flat control versus a sharp control. Now, on the joystick here, this is a little bit different than how it works in drum mode. Here, up and down, is our pitch bend. So again, pushing it up is kind of the same as pushing the pitch bend wheel up, same as pushing it down. Same thing, pushing it down, I should say. The only thing to note here is because this control stick, the action on it is pretty small, so it is set to be half the distance of your synthesizer's pitch bend wheel. So, just to talk through an example of that, if my synthesizer is set so that this pitch bend wheel goes up a whole octave, this control is only going to do half that. It's only going to go a half octave in either direction. So, for instance, if you want your controller to have a bend range of one note, you would set your synthesizer to have a bend range of 2 notes. And this will do, again, half of whatever your synthesizer is set to. I did that because I thought it would be really awkward trying to set up a synth to use such a tiny pitch bend control, and then if you wanted to also play on the synth, it'd be really jarring. So cutting it to half seemed like the best solution. That way you can play it more intuitively with a full sweep pitch bend wheel, but still get some use out of this for some minor fluctuations and modulation effects, even though you don't have that full sweep of the control. Otherwise, it just jumped all over the place when you were trying to do some minor modulation. When moving left and right, that will pan the sound if your synth supports pan. I don't know if it will come through in the final mix here, but if you check on the screen, the pan setting for the synthesizer is located right here. As you can see, panning left, panning right. Maybe I can zoom in, hopefully that's visible. It may not be audible in this sense, but that does give a pan control on that standard CC, which is CC10. So if your synthesizer supports a pan control, it should be set to that CC by default. But long story short, that controls CC10, and you can map that to whatever you want realistically, but by default that is your pan. Now, the triggers on the GameCube controller, some of you may know, they have this full range of analog motion, and then they hit a point where they click. So Synth Mode makes a lot more use of this than the drum mode does. The drum mode really, that action up to the click doesn't do anything. It plays a drum trigger when you click it. In Synth Mode, we do actually make full use of that analog sweep. So my right hand trigger controls modulation. So as I play a note, so you can hear, as you move that up and down, that would be the same thing as moving your synth's modulation controller up and down. Similar on the left trigger, but this time we have our velocity. I'm going to switch to something essentially not a pad here. Okay, so to demonstrate the velocity control, I've switched to something with a little less sustain. So to demonstrate that, this is the standard velocity. And by default, this has a fairly small range of control. That is one of the things, if you think about doing a customization, that can always be changed. But that way you're always playing at a decent velocity. Even if you don't want to bother holding the trigger down, you're still at an audible velocity, but it's still noticeable when you push it to give it that extra oomph or accent. So the D-pad, this can be used to control your octave and transposition. The up and down buttons will shift your octave. So by default, down is our middle C. If I push down, we jump down an octave. If I push down again, I'm down 2 octaves. Back up. Same thing going up. So this has a range, total range of 5 octaves. The reason it's set there is just to keep you from getting completely lost, since there's no real visual way to tell what octave you're in. To that note as well, the start button will reset any transposition or octave changes you have in place. So if you do get lost, start will always jump you back to middle C. It also serves as kind of a MIDI panic button. So if a note is stuck, it will send a note off signal. So just be warned, if you're trying to play something and you hit start, you may interrupt what you're trying to play when it sends that shut off. So I mentioned before, the D-pad also controls transposition. That is done with the side-to-side buttons. So that's C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and that's where it stops. So this will take you 11 steps up, essentially, because if you want to go to the next C, just use your octave button. So transpose will take you anywhere between the octave controls that you want to go. I thought it was important to give that flexibility so that you could kind of shift and more easily play whatever scale you're trying to be in. However, it is really easy to get lost if you're in the upper values of transposing. So again, that reset will take you back to home base, where down is your middle C. So with those controls, you can hit pretty much any note you could need to from a MIDI perspective, all just using the controller, not having to interface with anything else. That was an important feature for me, because I think the main purpose of this would be a really cool performance controller. It kind of takes some of the flavor out if you're constantly having to turn around and mess with your synth, right? The idea being you could set up your synthesizer, you can control it from here. You might have to change a patch, but that would be about it. So having that full range of notes and transposition is really important, and I think it works well here. And finally, you may notice I was skipping over these face buttons. So there was nothing I could think of from a synth perspective to do, since face buttons, they're not really good for CC values. So what they're set to do by default is to send drum triggers. That way, you could, if you have a MIDI module or 2 devices in your MIDI chain, this pad will send drum triggers on channel 10 for drums, while the rest of your synth controller, if I forgot to mention it earlier, everything in synth mode is sending on channel 1 by default. But these drum triggers will send on channel 10. That way you can kind of route your MIDI setup, even if you don't have a general MIDI module. It'll probably do that out of the box. But even if you don't, you can use your MIDI signal chain to use channel 10 to trigger drum samples. You could use it to trigger even a hardware sampler if you wanted to. Basically whatever you want. But by default, just to assign them out, and you can map them however you want. To assign them out, I've got just some basic drum triggers here. So A is going to be your kick. B is going to be a snare. Then Y is your closed hat. And X is going to be a clap. And I realize that that kick may not be audible Still on that 808 kit, so it's way down there. If you're on the phone, there's probably no way you're hearing that, but it is triggering, I promise. That is an overview of Synth Mode. So just to recap, the joystick triggers all your notes. The Z button, that's what you use to access your black keys, your flats. You've got your modulation and velocity controls on the analog sweep of the triggers. You've got a pitch bend, as well as a pan control with the joystick, and you can octave and transpose as well. Alright, now it is time for one of my favorite modes. I get really excited. I think this is one of the coolest things about this, and that is what I call DK mode, which is a mode specifically designed to use the Donkey Kong bongos for controlling drum samples. So to get into DK mode, I'm starting in Synth Mode with my blue light. I just push the button again, and when both lights are lit, that's how you know it's your bongos. So, how this works is, again, being meant for drum channels, this mode is sending on channel 10. Essentially, these bongos have 4 different sections, as well as they can detect a clap. So, when you press each of these pads, it triggers a different drum sample. I'll flash something up on the screen to show this here. And in the default mode, this bottom right is used to kind of toggle. That way you can get at just a few more drum sounds. So for instance, and that just kind of helps you. We'll see if that sounded any good. My rhythm is bad, and my monitoring has a hell of a delay on it. Makes it a little weird. So that is what I call the default kit. And if you use the start button here, that is how you change and cycle through the kits. So there's 4 different kits. There's this first one with that toggle. And the clap. Now, for doing a live show, I thought that clap could get you in a lot of trouble since it's really just sound sensitive. So your next kit works the exact same way, but the clap is disabled. That way your mic isn't picking up all the fun stage noise or anything and just blasting clap samples all over the place. Then the next kit is what I call the bongo kit. And this is, they're bongos, right? So they should do bongo sounds. So. And now when you first cycle into the bongo kit, again, your clap will register. Pressing start again will take you to the 4th kit, which is just the bongo kit. And again, I have no rhythm. I wish I did for the sake of this. I would really love to see someone with rhythm bust this out. I think it would be really exciting to see. But again, like I mentioned before, this is just sending MIDI notes on channel 10. You can map this to a sampler. You could map this to whatever you want. As long as it's MIDI capable, you should be able to make it work. So that really covers all the kind of main modes and functions of the device. So I will kick it back over to, I guess to me, and wrap this up. Thank you all so much for watching. So again, if you made it this far, thanks for checking it out. It was about all I wanted to show off on the GC to MIDI. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, leave a comment. I try to be pretty active in responding to those. There's also details on the website where you can ping me with questions, etc. And again, last shameless plug, you can order these off my site. There will be a link in the description. If you think that's neat, but it's not for you, definitely, do the like and subscribe thing. That feels weird to say, but apparently it's like super helpful if you do that. Okay, that's all for this video. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.